Hello everyone, I'm Janine Kakmar with PHTV Channel 4 Palos Heights, back with our show all about books. Now on this show, many of you know we talk about books, we talk about writers, publishing, and we have a special guest with us who'll talk about what they're reading and writing. But before we get to our guest, we're going to talk about some of the new releases coming out in May. Now, and then we'll talk about some of the New York Times bestsellers as well. Now, we won't be able to talk about all the new releases, of course, but we'll talk about some of the ones that are getting a lot of attention. We'll start with our first book. We've got The Best of Adam Sharp by Graham Simpson. Now, this guy is an international best-selling author. He wrote one of my favorite series recently, The Rosie Effect and The Rosie Project, which are hilarious stories of his main character, Don Tillman, in his search for the perfect wife. Now, his new book, The Best of Adam Sharp, is a book about growing old, feeling young, happy times, sad memories, and the role that music plays in our lives together. In an interview, the author was talking about how he got to write this book. Everybody keeps saying, well, how did you write this story? And he was talking about his wife, who he was married to, has been married to for 20 years. And he went on a vacation in France in a farmhouse. And his wife had a relationship with another man before they were married. She was, they were seeing each other for some time. But after she got married to the author, she was just friends with him for all these years. Well, while they were on vacation, this man calls up Graham Simpson's wife and says, crying because he broke up with his wife. And the author's wife says, oh, can we please invite him over because he's having such a hard time? And the author goes, absolutely not, because I didn't like this guy then. I'm not going to like him now. But his wife kept asking him, and so he goes, fine, have him come over, have him come join us on our vacation in France. And so he did. And they actually had a really good time together. They had a lot of fun together. But they got the author thinking about the whole premise, like, what if this guy, when he came back into her life, their old relationship was rekindled after 20 years? And that's what the book is about. The book is a reflection of how we deal with the past. And since the main character, Adam Sharp, is a piano player in the book, there's also, the book reflects on the role of music in our lives. In fact, it comes with a playlist of music. A playlist actually accompanies the book and includes the songs like Hey Jude from the Beatles and Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, the Four Tops' Walk Away Renee, to music from Elton John to Cher to Edith Piaf and many others, Van Morrison, a whole slew of them. But The Best of Adam Sharp follows along with emotion and humor one man as he looks back in his life and just has to decide whether having a second chance is worth the risk. So I haven't read this book, but I have read The Rosie Project and The Rosie Effect. And if you've not read those two books, I highly recommend them. They are very funny. You're going to laugh out loud, actually, when you read those books. His main character, Don Tillman, is hilarious. And they're actually making it into a movie now, too, soon. So you'll have to wait to see how they either mess it up or they get it right. So we'll have to get back on that one. Our second featured title is Into the Water by Paula Hawkins. Now, many of you know this author from her mega best-selling hit, The Girl on the Train, which was just come out in a movie. And just in time for this author, because I guess before that book was actually published, she was really in desperate times financially. So she published that book and got the movie made, so she's doing good. She's written her second book, which is actually another psychological thriller about two women, a single mother and a teenage girl who are found dead in the bottom of a river in northern England. And an investigation shows that these women actually have a complicated and intertwined history. And nobody seems to do complicated and intertwined better than Paula Hawkins, because you'll find that this book is following the same route as The Girl on the Train, where there are many layers of realities and characters, viewpoints, and that kind of thing. So you got to pay attention to which viewpoint is actually the accurate one. And in an interview, the author said that her new story is about how your memories as a child form you as the person you are. And she's always been interested in how one person can remember an event so completely different from their siblings or from the people who were there at the time. So her book questions the reliability of memory, and in all the dangerous ways that the past can reach to the future and the present. So our third featured title is a book by one of my favorite authors, Dennis Lehane. It's titled Since We Fell. Dennis Lehane has written several books, but one of my favorite books of him is his recent trilogy he had out, The Given Day, Live by Night, and World Gone By. I love them for the memorable characters, for the range of history. There's a lot of historical elements in this book, and it ranges from the Prohibition period all the way through World War II. And actually, those were just made into one movie titled Live by Night, which was starring and directed by Ben Affleck. But in his new book, he talks about his new book, Since We Fell, is a 14th novel about an agoraphobic journalist who believes her husband is leading a secret life, and it leads to conspiracy, violence, and deception. And I saw in an interview, Dennis Lehane was in town a few years back, and I went to see him talk, and he spoke about his writing influences. And he mentioned that his parents were immigrants from Ireland. They settled in Boston in the 1970s. And his mother got him a library card when he was a very young boy. And almost every day he would walk from his home way across town to almost to the heart of Dorchester, where they were dealing with a lot of the riots of the 1970s Boston. And he says it was that walk to the library where he came alive from an artistic standpoint, because he says it's the main reason that the questions of economics and race and class dominate his work. So Since We Fell, his new book, you'll have a chance to see some of that. He also does a lot now of screenwriting. So he recently just moved from Boston to Los Angeles, or somewhere in California, where he's actually spending a lot more time writing screenplays. And he actually, for this book, he wrote the screenplay for this book at the same time he wrote the book, and they both were finished at the same time. So he's actually looking ahead somehow to make this a movie and a book. So we'll have to see how that turns out. So that's Dennis Lehane. We have to check him out. And if you haven't read that trilogy that I mentioned, do so. It's a great story. The characters, it's a family, Boston cops, and then they turn, some gangsters come in, and it's a great. Even Babe Ruth is in there. It's just great. Our next feature title is by a Chicago author, Philip Caputo. His new book is Some Rise by Sin. Now, he was born in Chicago. He was educated at Purdue and Loyola. He served in the Vietnam War as a Marine, and when he got out of the war, he wrote a memoir about his time in Vietnam, a critically acclaimed book titled A Rumor of War. He then wrote for the Chicago Tribune, and in 1972 won a Pulitzer Prize along with some other reporters for their article on the voting fraud in Chicago. But his new book is his first book since 2014, which was his last book was The Longest Road. And if you haven't read that one, I'm going to recommend another book for you. It's a fascinating book. That's a nonfiction book, and it's a story about how he travels across the United States, and he starts at the southernmost point in Key West, and he drives all the way to the northernmost point in Moose Jaw, Alaska. And along the way, he interviews and stops and talks to Americans of all shapes, sizes, and classes to get an idea of what Americans look like or what they think and really feel. So if you haven't read that book, that's a great book to take a look at. That's a nonfiction book. His new book is a book of fiction. And Caputo writes with a reporter's eye and his novelist's heart, and about an American missionary, a motorcycle riding missionary, Timothy Riordan, who's set in a small village in Mexico that's actually being harassed by the drug cartel. So the villagers form a vigilante group to try to fight back, and the priest wants to help them, but in doing so, if he decides to do that, he's going to be breaking his vows as a priest. So he's got another friend in the area, an expat, a doctor named Lisette Morena, but he still needs to confront his personal crisis in order to save the people in his care. So I haven't read this book, but anything by Phil Caputo I'm excited to read. He's written a range of things about Africa. He's written about the lions of Savo. So you'll have to check it out. He's got a lot of good things. If you're waiting for this book to come out, you have other books of his to read in the meantime. And our final feature title is The Best Land Under Heaven by Michael Wallace. Many of you might know him as a celebrated historian, and he's also the host of PBS series American Roads. Now, Michael Wallace has written about several historical legends such as Davy Crockett and Billy the Kid. But in this book, he writes about a story that we all think we really know everything about, the Donner Party. And he sets the record straight on that. He spent years retracing the ill-fated journey. He's uncovered some previously unknown new documents that revealed how greed and backbiting and recklessness and poor timing led this group of pioneers to become hopelessly trapped in what we call today Donner's Pass in the Sierra Nevada mountains in present-day California. The story begins in 1846 when manifest destiny ruled the land, when the drive was to settle from coast to coast. And two families started out, the Reeds and the Donners, and they started their journey west. They left from Springfield, Illinois. They were part of a much larger convoy, and their group of people consisted mostly of farmers with their families, bachelors and businessmen, all seeking the promised land in California. But they decided along the way to split from that convoy and to take a more non-traditional route, which, of course, was a disastrous mistake. Because combined with the group's inexperience, they were plagued by losing livestock to Indians and just treachery, the dangerous lands, the wagon breakdowns, internal dissension, and of course, the weather and the brutal winters of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Heavy snow brought in starvation, and nearly half of the group had died. 4 separate rescue attempts were made, and they found survivors had resorted to cannibalism to survive. But the author focuses on the people involved, those who were stuck in the mountains, those who walked to get help and supplies, and then eventually the rescuers. And he marks the bad advice that they followed and the good advice that wasn't. Publishers Weekly says that the Donner Party's struggle and determination continue to fascinate people, and Wallace's account of bravery and luck and failure illuminate the realities of westward expansion. So, something to put on your list as well. So, those are some of the features that are coming out in May. Now we'll touch a little bit on our next 2 slides. We'll show the New York Times bestsellers coming out. And we have Amanda Quick with her new book, The Girl Who Knew Too Much. Richard Russo has a book of short stories out called Trajectory. Scott Turow, another Chicago writer, of course, has his new book out, Testimony. Danielle Steele, Against All Odds. And of course, Michael Crichton, who's been dead for several years, so it's actually the estate of Michael Crichton, has a new book, The Dragon Teeth. Lincoln Child has Full Wolf Moon. Nancy Thayer, The Secrets in Summer. And Steve Hunter, G-Man. So those are some of the New York Times bestsellers coming out. And we're going to start something new on our show this month. I see a lot of you around, and you've seen these shows in the past, and you said, "Hey, I've read this book. I tried the one book that you talked about, and I thought such and such about this." And so, what we're going to do is, we're going to at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the email. You can send your comments or your reviews of the books that you actually read. So make sure you include the title and author. And then the next show, we'll talk about some of the reviews that people have been sending in about some of these books. Because these books are new. Keep in mind, I have not read any of these books because they're coming out. We film in April. This is coming out in May. So they haven't come out yet. But I do know many of the authors by their previous works. But that doesn't always matter. That's always the tricky thing. An author that you really love will come out with a new book, and you're like, "Oh, I don't like this book so much," So read the books. Let us hear your feedback on them and send it to the email. We'll mention it next time. So that's our book part of the show. Now we get a chance to talk with our special guest. So come on down, Josh.
Hello.
Hey. Today we have with us our film spotting co-host, Josh Larsen. Josh is a local resident in Palos Heights, and he's also editor of Think Christian, a faith and culture-based website, right? Mm-hmm. So thank you, Josh, for coming out. I know you've got lots of things, busy man, all this kind of thing. But I knew you first because we did some programs at the library because you were as a film critic. And I think I mentioned this to you. I always thought, like a dream job would be a film critic, because really, what do you do as a film critic? You sit and watch movies all day long. And so I want you to set the record straight on me. What does a film critic actually do?
It is a dream job. I consider it a dream job. I had that as my sole job for about 7 years when I was with the Naperville Sun.
Okay.
So that was the only thing I was doing at that time, and it was watching a lot of movies pretty much all day. But the trick is that when you get done doing that, they expect you to write about them.
Darn.
So yeah, so there is a little bit of work involved, and you find that 2 movies in a day, before you know it, the day's almost gone.
Yeah.
And so you got to fit that work in as well. So yeah, it's not much to complain about, and I still get to do a fair amount of movie viewing now, just not quite as many or on quite as tight of a deadline.
How does that work? Because, do you have to watch a movie in a different mindset when you know you're going to write about it? Or can you just go to a movie and enjoy it and then and I'm going to write about it?
That's a good question. I would say if you get into something like film criticism, you enjoy the part of paying close attention. That is enjoyable.
Okay.
But I know what you mean. For me, it's often the question of, am I going to take any notes while watching this movie? Because I am a note taker. And I usually almost always do, unless it's something that I'm watching with the family and maybe I've seen before. But even with them, sometimes I'll keep a notepad handy. It doesn't feel like work, though, because again, I like paying that close attention and watching the choices that the filmmakers are making and thinking about how it relates to other work, and that's all fun to me. So I do just sit back and enjoy the movies, but maybe a little bit differently than other people.
Yeah. So your co-host of Film Spotting, when does that run, or when do we?
Sure, you can listen to it on the radio in the Chicago area on WBEZ. It airs on Friday and Saturday nights, but we are probably most popular as a podcast, which is a growing form that people are getting into and have been into. Film Spotting was started by Adam Campinar, who is the co-host along with me, and Sam Van Halgren, who is the producer now, way back in 2005. They founded the show, and that was just at the beginning of podcasts. So they've built up a following. I joined the show in 2012, and so most people listen to us, on their phones through iTunes or some other podcast app. Yeah.
Okay, so that's how they find you.
Right.
Okay. And then how do you split your time with that? Then you're also an editor of Think Christian.
Right.
Okay.
So Film Spotting is sort of a hobby side job. Think Christian is the day job, and I do get to do some film work there as well, because the purpose of that website is to explore all of culture and consider what it might mean for Christians who are interested in thinking about these things theologically. So art is part of that. So I do write about film, but we also cover science topics. We cover politics as well, which has been really interesting lately. And we really take a full view of culture and look at it from a Christian perspective. So I do get to do some film work there, but as editor, I'm often working with a whole series and group of writers who are covering all different things.
Okay. And then you were working on a book you talked about. Yeah. You're just finishing up a book?
I'm officially done with the writing and the editing of it. So it's out on June 13. Movies Are Prayers. So this has been the interesting marketing phase, which is all new to me, trying to get the word out and connecting with people who might be interested. Just letting them know.
Who's the publisher, or how did that work?
It's with InterVarsity Press, so they're in the western suburbs of Chicago, and they were aware of my work both with Think Christian and Film Spotting, and wanted to know if I had any book-length ideas. So we talked for a while about some possibilities, and came up with this notion of looking at movies as different forms of prayer. So whether that would be lament or confession or praise, looking at those traditions in the Christian tradition, and then saying, well, how might some movies be functioning in the same way? Not necessarily religious movies. So I don't write about the Ten Commandments or anything like Chariots of Fire, but movies you might not think about as having any sort of spiritual So there's a chapter that begins with Toy Story and looking at how a scene in there functions as a prayer of confession. I spend a lot of time on some Hitchcock films in that chapter as well. And I really try to spread around the genres of films, the older films and newer films, and look at them through this lens.
It's so you've seen, so obviously these are movies you've seen before. Was this something you had to go back and look at again? I mean, through that kind of view or something? What's the word I'm trying to kind of think of? But,
yeah, sure. It involved a lot of rewatching, which I would normally want to do anyways if I'm going to reconsider a movie. But in this case, in particular, I had to first say, was my instinct right that this movie functioned the way I thought it might have, like this form of prayer? And in some cases, I would watch it again and it just wouldn't fit. So I tossed that aside. And then even the cases then where I thought, okay, this is right, there's something here, it would involve very close observing of what was going on in the movie, because I wanted to make sure not to be forcing these ideas onto the films, but instead talk primarily about what the movies are doing, the choices the filmmakers are making, and draw from those things we see on the screen and bring them into this realm of prayer, how these choices and these techniques are allowing us to see that movie as a form of prayer too. So yeah, I had to rewatch a lot.
Yeah, you know, and I'm going to back up when you were talking about, when you look at a movie that, just when you said something, do you have like a format when you look at movies, like a mental thing, like certain things that you watch a film for, or do you just kind of have to take each film when you want you know you want to write about it or talk about it? How does that work for you?
I try not to bring too much to the film because, again, I want to give the filmmakers and the people behind it and the finished product itself the first say. So, but that's difficult to do, of course, because I do have the knowledge of the other movies they may have made in the background, maybe the genre it's in. I have associations with.
It's kind of like the books we were talking about, right?
Absolutely.
The authors, like,
expectations.
Okay, yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. So I try to put those aside, but I can't deny that, you know, they're there somewhere. I think I don't formalize that, so I don't have like any sort of chart or checkbox that I'm going in with to try to put that aside. But it's also interesting because not every film I see will I write about for Think Christian. If I know that I think there might be something there worth exploring for Think Christian, then maybe I turn that part of my mind on a little bit.
Sure.
But really, I first approach it as a movie fan, see what the film gives me, and then that helps me to think about where I could take that in my response. I'm curious about, have there
been trends? Have you noticed any trends over the years when you watch movies? Like things like, you know, books, you can see things are kind of cyclical sometimes.
Sure.
Like right now, there's so many books now with the, you know, with the, like the Gone Girl phenomena, where, you know, you have those, you know, and the girl on the train, that kind of thing. They have the main character is a female protagonist who's got some severe, you know, problems going on, that kind of thing. That seems to be like a big thing right now. At films, have you noticed any types of trends? There are, and it's interesting, a lot of times those are driven by the books, right? So you have the whole wave of YA films now that I think we're maybe coming to the end of, because some of those haven't, in the wake of the Hunger Games. There's no more books in Divergent, right? Right. Some of those have sort of been played out, at least at the box office. So, so books can drive that a lot of times. We're still, you know, right now it's an age of superhero films. Yeah. And Marvel. Also an age, Marvel primarily, and also an age of, there's so many different forms this takes, so I usually just call them reheat films, because they can be a reboot of a movie that existed before. It can be a sequel that comes right in line with a movie from a few years ago. It can be a sequel of something that came out 20 years ago. So Hollywood is very interested in known properties, things they can sell easily because we have some knowledge of what it's about. And that seems to be what we're awash in. Doesn't always make for the best films, but we can be surprised too. So when Mad Max Fury Road would be an example of one of these reheats, that was one of my favorite movies of that year. I think we're 2 or 3 years away from that now. Already? And that revived, I know, that revived a series that the last film I think had come out in the 80s. Right. But did it in a completely inventive way. So I'm certainly open to these things, but you always worry when you're getting too much of one style of movie. You know, you want a variety. So. You know what? I just noticed. Okay, now again, we're filming in April, so last night was the premiere of the Fargo season 3.
Yes,
okay,
right.
Now Fargo, that movie came out when?
That is 1996, I believe.
Are
So
you
that's a perfect
kidding?
example of
Oh
what
my
I'm talking
God.
about. Is now they've reheated that into a FX anthology series, you know,
Right.
which I haven't watched it, but I've heard is quite good. So
Right, and now, of course, it was produced by the Coen brothers. They had a very definitive style, and it was, you know, many people either liked it or hated that movie. But then when they said they want to remake it with a series on TV now, which I think television seems to be getting a lot more into some really much
Yes,
higher quality things.
absolutely.
But what I think Hawley is the director of the, don't quote me on that, but he was like an unheard of director who's going to be running the Fargo series on TV. People are like, okay, is this going to be any good? And but it turned out that he actually made it's based on a movie with set directors and the Coen brothers, but he's made something completely his own. And season 3, people had, each season got better actually. And from the reviews that I've read, and this season, I watched the opener last night.
Oh, did you? Okay.
It's very good.
I wish I had time I don't have time for television much out anyway, so.
Well, it's all recorded. It's all DVR. Thank God for that.
Right. That helps.
So, midnight you can put on anything. But so there just seems to be a whole range of things out there now. I mean, we can talk all about all kinds of things like that. But I want to get back to you as a writer on the book. Because in case people, I know I talk with people who are interested in writing, that kind of thing. What was your process as a writer for this book, or maybe, well, it'll probably go to the job you have anyways because you're an editor, right?
Yeah, it was very different because most of the stuff I write is not long form at all. It's under 1,000 words.
Okay.
And what I edit as well, we tend to run fairly short things on Think Christian. So this was not just extending that, it was going way beyond that. So it helped to have a set project in mind where there were specific goals I was trying to achieve, and then you can break it down a chapter at a time. So I'm going to consider prayers of lament in this chapter. So first I had to research what do we mean by lament? What is the tradition of prayers of lament? What are biblical examples of prayers of lament? And feel like I had a good understanding of what the existing tradition, religious tradition was. And that allowed me to think about, okay, what are the films that I know that I've seen operating that way? And so I would then go and watch those. As far as the writing, it involved, partly because of schedule, but also because it was a bit more intense and expansive of a project, setting aside a good hour every morning, way before anyone else was up, and this was just what I was going to do for those 60 to 90 minutes. Because it could not be something I squeezed in after work or did late at night. I mean, I was doing film spotting in those times. So the concept of trying to find that space in the day as I currently had it just wasn't going to work. So I got a lot less sleep in that year. And I can't say I enjoy that. I'm not naturally a morning person. I'd rather stay up, late and do this, but I knew that wouldn't happen, So I had to force myself to get up, and it was really productive for me. And I've heard from other people that works as well, too.
So you were really focused in that.
Exactly. Like, the difficulty in this day and age with the internet as research is it makes it so much easier, but you're also then you're online, right? So it's tempting to easily go somewhere else, or you're not getting quite as many notifications at 4:35 in the morning, but still that could happen. So I had to keep that tunnel vision when I would do research online. But when it came to writing, just having that absolute quiet, nothing else I had to respond to or even think about was really beneficial for me.
Yeah, because you can so easily go down the rabbit's hole of getting and there goes your morning.
Yep, pretty much.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming out here today.
Thank you.
We learned about one of our local greats here in town, film writer, film critic, an editor of Think Christian, Josh Larsen. Thank you so much for coming up and sharing us your ideas. Good luck with your book. We'll have a picture of it up on the slides. It'll be available where?
June 13. And you can order it on Amazon, but local bookstores should have it as well.
All right, there you got it. So go get your copy.
Thanks
again.
for
coming. Thank you all for joining us this time. We'll see you next month. And send us your comments. We'll look forward to hearing what you think of some of the books we talk about. So thanks for joining us.